be an afterthought. We refuse to be tokenized, used to garnish panels, or used to meet inclusiveness at quotas, because African women make up the majority of the population on this continent. Climate depends thoughts, decisions, and actions must be led by us, for us, and with us, rather than dedicated by businesses or so-called developed imperialist partners and their agencies. It is intolerable for African women's voices and agendas to be excluded and marginalized on their own soil by our own institutions. We gathered on the outskirts of this meeting to express our concerns and hold the global north and climate polluters accountable. African women are keeping a careful eye on them. Their only role in this summit should be to agree to carry out their responsibilities, providing their due share of grant funding, and abstaining from supporting damaging market-based schemes in the name of climate solutions. The struggles of young women in island and island communities, women-scale farmers dealing with unpredictable weather patterns, women living with disabilities in the face of climate emergencies, and women living in urban communities are stark reminders of the impact, losses, and damages that have been experienced on this continent. The voices of these communities must be central to the agenda of this climate summit. Importantly, we are here to claim and own our complex realities for those who believe that African women are helpless, victims waiting to be served. Yes, we are among the most affected by the climate issue, but we are also the architects of genuine, long-term, and gender-just climate solutions. As we move from Nairobi to COP28, we urge our leaders, and indeed the world leaders, to commit to putting African women's leadership at the center of climate action. Women are underrepresented in global climate change policy processes in Africa. African governments must actively encourage and promote women's participation and engagement in all elements of climate policy, from design to implementation and monitoring, and ensure that they're contextually relevant to their experience and lived realities. We also we demand climate finance in the form of grants and public funding, guided by the principles of collective but differentiated responsibilities. The establishment of a loss and damage fund to cover economic and non-economic losses and damages, and a stronger financial commitment during the global stocktake and new collective and quantified goal is what we're asking for. We reject forced solutions on our land that are aimed to generate private profit and legitimize the global north's lack of ambition in decreasing emissions. Carbon markets and geoengineering are bogus solutions that hurt our planet and people. Net zero is not true net zero. We call them to commit on delivering on the 2003 Maputo Declaration by allocating at least 10% of African countries' national budget to domestic agricultural financing. Only gender-just and Pan-African policies and solutions that protect indigenous farmers and traditional farmers' system from commoditization, the effects of climate change, and capture of multinational corporations promoting industrial agriculture can ensure Africans' food and nutrition security. We call that involve African. We want our leaders to involve African individuals and communities actively and systematically in climate change awareness programs and climate activities to enhance community ownership of climate initiatives, particularly in adaptation, just transition, and catastrophic risk efforts. For the global north, we call on them to reduce your emissions by eliminating fossil fuels now. Contribute your fair share of grant and public funding rather than loans and private market-based finance. Remove yourself from the perspective of the colonial past. Multilateral spaces must embrace collaborative leadership concepts and put an end to the overt and covert control of the global north. Africa and other states from the global south have the right to equal decision-making in the international processes. We, African women, pledge to do everything in our power to free ourselves and our communities from the exploitation of existing economic and social institutions that have contributed to the difficulties we face today. Allow our voices to be heard, and let our actions serve as a light of hope for a more sustainable and just future for all. In solidarity, we stand with all African women who are not here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Priscilla. And just for the audience, we won't have time for a discussion, but we will keep going for a few more minutes because I think it's crucial also to hear from my good friend Selwyn, who's going to tell us what's going to happen at the UN General Assembly and the Climate Action Summit on the way to COP. Thank you, Selwyn. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Kate, and good morning to all of you. And first, let me extend congratulations to all of you as we reflect on the outcomes of the summit for really ensuring that the world has clearly heard the priorities of Africa. It's heard from African civil society organizations, it's heard from African leaders, and it's heard from African young people as well. And the convening of this summit really comes at a critical juncture on the road to COP28, but also a critical juncture in our fight against the climate crisis. The reality is that we're way off track. Every indicator on climate is heading in the wrong direction. Global emissions are at their highest levels, and they continue to rise. At a moment when the world should be reducing its production and use of fossil fuels, we're seeing massive expansion in fossil fuels, primarily led by countries in the G7 and other developed countries. The reality is that as we move close to the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement, impacts will rise, and we're already bearing witness to this. And these impacts are being disproportionately felt in countries and regions like Africa that have contributed the least to the climate crisis. So as the Secretary General clearly indicated yesterday, we have this enormous global challenge of significantly reducing greenhouse gas emissions. 20 countries account for 80% of global emissions. And we also need to urgently deliver climate justice to those on the front lines of the climate crisis. At this summit, we've clearly heard from Africa that its priority is to pursue an accelerated transition. It's just an equitable transition to a renewable energy, climate resilient future. But in order to enable that pursuit and acceleration, it requires enabling conditions at the global level. Access to affordable finance at scale, fair trading arrangements, debt relief, access to technologies, reform of the international financial architecture to name some of the priorities that have been expressed by many African leaders. So in a real sense, the ball is now in the court of many who showed up here over the course of these last few days and made these eloquent statements. It cannot be business as usual. Promises made must be promises kept. We in the United Nations and the Secretary General, he intends to hold everyone to account. And this is the premise for his Climate Ambition Summit on the 20th. On the 20th of September. He has invited all countries to participate. All countries have been invited to participate. But there is a price of entry. In his invitation to leaders, he has clearly defined, as he did yesterday, what he expects leaders to deliver. He expects the developed countries to honor their commitments on finance. He expects them to contribute to the replenishment of the Green Climate Fund. He expects all major economies, as he said yesterday, to fast forward their net zero commitments, to clearly identify how they intend to phase out fossil fuels and how they intend to deliver climate justice to those on the front lines of the climate crisis. He's established a deadline of September 7th, the next few days, for leaders and countries to respond to his letter of invitation. He's also extended an open invitation to the private sector and to financial institutions and to cities and regions. He's asked them to produce credible transition plans with interim targets, transition plans with targets that are aligned with the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement, targets that don't involve greenwashing, targets with fossil fuel phase-out plans, and as well as commitments to support a just and equitable transition. Those that have made or are able to meet this bar of entry will gain access to participate in the Secretary General's Climate Ambition Summit. And finally, I want to assure all of you that the voices of Africa, African leaders, African civil society, African young people will be heard at the Secretary General's Climate Ambition Summit. The priorities of Africa, President Ruto has been invited, and I was just discussing with Elizabeth. Elizabeth, of course, you are invited to the Secretary General's Climate Ambition Summit to really provide and ensure that the voices of African young people are heard at this important global gathering. So, as we reflect on this moment, as we reflect on this summit, it is absolutely clear that there's a lot of unfinished business. Africa has spoken, the world has listened, but now the world needs to act to deliver on Africa's priorities. I thank you.
Thank you, Selwyn, and thank you for that commitment to ensure that African voices are heard at the Climate Ambition Summit. Priscilla is already on the case for African women as well. So looking forward to seeing those of you that can make it in New York. You'll be happy to hear I'm not going to make a speech. I'm just going to make a couple of wrap-up comments. I just want to highlight one thing that Selwyn spoke about, which is transition plans. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the language, transition plans are about what you commit to do today in order to change what you were going to do over the next 5 years. We have very little time to halve global emissions, and indeed, as the speakers have said, the responsibility sits with the biggest polluters. But all of us need to think about commitments we can make today to change the trajectory over the next 5 years. And the COP28 will be about the global stocktake, and the action track and the negotiations should come together. And I just want to echo something, because he's in the audience. Mo Ibrahim talked yesterday about the importance of governance. And we need fair, transparent, and fit-for-purpose governance at every level of implementation of the green transition. We need a whole-of-society mobilization, as we have heard from the speakers. Climate change is no longer a small issue on the menu of environmentalists and ministries of environment. It requires heads of state, ministers of finance, CEOs, village leaders, religious leaders, a whole of society mobilization to drive the ambition that we need. And I'm very much hoping that here today at the Africa Climate Summit, the African Union Declaration is going to provide a new standard in that whole of society mobilization for transition. So I would like you to give a round of applause to our speakers, and you'll be hearing more from them, I'm sure, over the coming months. And we're very much looking forward to handing back to the Kenyan government to share with us what has been achieved over the last few days. So thank you very much to our speakers, greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Signale Sodana nindugu di kayo makan tarino. Tarino fakate midaga sa kuyemigo. Safari tante banane karamoyele. Sila dapsifte banane tarbeno lale. Sila dapsifte banane tarbeno lale. Lo hoya yo yamagalo Sofia warimoyele. Gosa kuye kesa choko magamba darba. Duse dage kote daha makanda haba. Duse dage kote daha makanda haba. Dahaba simbinde sisa kuye madarba. Safari tante banane karamoyele. Sila dapsifte banane tarbeno lale. Sila dapsifte banane tarbeno lale. Lo hoya yo yamagalo Sofia warimoyele. Kalamu chachabe kawino manto chani. Nidagum dabarte gosmigo manto chani. Nidagum dabarte gosmigo manto chani. Wamigo daranki dambe nones gorsani. Safari tante banane karamoyele. Sila dapsifte banane tarbeno lale. Sila dapsifte banane tarbeno lale. Lo hoya yo yamagalo Sofia warimoyele. Safari tante banane karamoyele. Sila dapsifte banane tarbeno lale. Sila dapsifte banane tarbeno lale. Lo hoya yo yamagalo Sofia warimoyele.